Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, an almanac of garden history, literature, and small botanical joys. I'm Jennifer Ebeling, and today is April 15th. Mid-April carries a sense of momentum. The month is already half gone. The soil feels warmer now when you press your palm into it. Daffodils nod without apology. This is part of the season that rewards proximity. Spring belongs near your front door, where you can't miss it as you come and go. The bulbs you waited for all winter are blooming, and the flowering shrubs are right there to greet you first. Fall color can live at the edges of your property, way off in the distance, but spring should be close. Step into it slowly, on purpose, and remember that when you're designing your garden. Here's today's garden history. It was on this day in 1452 that Leonardo da Vinci was born in the hills of Tuscany. Leonardo grew into a man who spent as much time in the garden in the field as he did before any canvas. He was the first to record that leaves on a stem spiral in a pattern, each one angled away from the one below it so that rain could reach every level and no leaf would steal another's light. Leonardo noticed that tree rings recorded wet years and dry ones. He followed water through gravel and moss, tracking how it fed what grew nearby. He sketched trees with such exactness, angles and curves so precise that botanists can still identify the species from his notebooks centuries later. Leonardo once wrote, "We know more about the movement of celestial bodies than about the soil underfoot." In 1498, Duke Ludovico Sforza, Leonardo's patron in Milan, gifted him a vineyard as payment for the Last Supper, 16 rows of vines. In the evenings, Leonardo would go sit outside and watch the grapes grow. In his garden beds, Leonardo grew lilies, violets, and irises, flowers he drew again and again until he could paint them exactly as they were. Leonardo also wrote, "The wisest and noblest teacher is nature itself." In 1519, Leonardo died in France in service of King Francis I. He was 67. His notebooks, thousands of pages, held botanical observations alongside flying machines and anatomical drawings. They were all part of the same inquiry: how things grow, move, and hold together. Leonardo's vineyard in Milan was lost for centuries, then rediscovered and replanted. It still produces wine today. And it was on this day, in 1641, that Robert Sibbald was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. Robert's earliest memory was of leaving. When he was 10 years old, his family fled Edinburgh as Oliver Cromwell's army approached. His father died in the chaos of those years, and Robert grew up in a world that kept shifting under his feet. He later wrote that he chose medicine to stay away from the factions of law and theology that had ruined so many families. Robert wanted a world of plants and science because the world of men and politics was just too cruel. Robert studied at Edinburgh, then Leiden, and finally took his medical degree in France. By the time he returned home to Edinburgh, he had one idea that he could not let go of. Scotland needed its own physic garden. In 1670, Robert and his colleague Andrew Balfour leased a small plot of land near Holyrood Abbey, roughly the size of a tennis court. There, they planted daisies and horehound for coughs, licorice for asthma, fennel to settle digestion, yarrow for fevers, and mallow for scurvy. The belief was simple: the land offered what was needed if you learned to read it. That tiny plot would eventually become the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, one of the world's greatest botanical institutions. But Robert's life was not without humiliation. In 1685, after a brief conversion to Catholicism, a mob surrounded his house. Robert escaped over a back wall, disguised as a woman, and fled to London. He returned quietly and spent the rest of his life rebuilding what a single night had broken. Robert's great work, Scotia Illustrata, published in 1684, catalogued Scotland's plants, animals, and geology, the first systemic account of the country's natural life. In his final years, Robert faced financial ruin. He had spent his personal fortune building Scotland's medical institutions. By 1707, he was forced to sell more than 1,000 volumes from his beloved library. Robert died in August of 1722 at the age of 81. He was buried in Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh, the city he spent his life trying to map and protect. Robert's name lives on in Sibbaldia, a small hardy perennial that grows in the Scottish Highlands. It was named for him by Carl Linnaeus. In today's Unearthed Words, we hear an excerpt from Carpe Diem by the American poet and garden writer Anne Higginson Spencer, born on this day, April 15th, in 1871. Anne lived and gardened between Illinois and coastal Massachusetts, tending her own plots and encouraging others to do the same. These lines imagine how she might choose to spend a final day on Earth, not in abstraction, but among living things. If this were my last day, I'm almost sure I'd spend it working in my garden. I would dig about my little plants and try to make them happy so they would endure long after me. This may be my last day for all I know. What a temptation just to spend it so. Anne didn't reach for anything grand when she imagined the end. She reached for the garden, the little plants, and perhaps a friend or two walking by. And I think about that every time I'm deciding whether or not to go outside. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, The Bean Book by Steve Sando and Julia Newberry. This book is part of Herbs and Kitchen Gardens Week here on The Daily Gardener. It's a week devoted to books that talk about how gardens feed us, heal us, and bring what grows outside into the kitchen. Steve Sando is the founder of Rancho Gordo, a company built entirely around heirloom beans. And Steve will tell you it began with a moment when he almost gave up. Steve writes, "My story with beans starts with me turning 40. I was prepared to get a bad job at a big box store and start a garden. My instincts told me that if I had a garden, things would work out somehow. I was right." Steve began growing beans and selling them at the farmer's market, and at the end of the season, he had cooked a pot of Rio Zapes, a bean similar to a pinto, but with a hint of coffee or chocolate. Steve writes simply, "I was hooked." The Bean Book is what grew from that pot. It explores heirloom varieties tied to valleys, families, and kitchen tables, beans with flavor and texture most of us have never tasted. This is the kind of book that belongs near the stove, open while something slowly simmers, or while plans quietly form for what to plant once the frost line lifts. And finally, here's something sweet to ignite the little botanic spark in your heart. It was on this day in 1791 that Alexander Garden died in London, far from the land where he did his best work. Alexander was a physician in Charleston, South Carolina. After his patients were seen, Alexander walked through sandy streets, along marsh edges, beside creeks where magnolias and unfamiliar blossoms grew. Alexander collected plants, wrapped them carefully, and sent them across the ocean to botanists who shared his love. But in Charleston, Alexander felt completely alone. In one letter, he admitted there was not a living soul nearby who cared about natural history. Alexander's conversations about plants had to travel by mail, and when a letter arrived from his dear friend John Ellis, a British naturalist and fellow collector, Alexander wrote back that it had revived what he called a little botanic spark. He wrote, "I know that every letter I receive not only revives a little botanic spark in my breast, but even increases its quantity and flaming force." After the Revolutionary War, Alexander, a loyalist, was forced into exile. He returned to England, but his son stayed in America. That divide was never healed. Alexander died in London in 1791, estranged from the country where all his best walks had been. The gardenia was named for him by his friend Carl Linnaeus. White, fragrant, opening at dusk. That name has outlasted everything else he did. And that little phrase Alexander wrote in that letter, the little botanic spark, is still here too, at the end of every episode of The Daily Gardener. As we close the show today, remember, spring rewards proximity. Not the grand view from the window, not the photograph. The thing you noticed right away when you opened the door. The bulb just breaking ground, the shrub just beginning to open, the smell of lilacs in the spring sunshine. Designed for that this year. Keep the things you love where you can't miss them. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener, and remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day.